Our next speaker is Kathleen Deagan, a distinguished research curator of archaeology Emerita and the Lockwood Professor of Florida and Caribbean Archaeology here at the Florida Museum of Natural History. Often cited as the woman who discovered Columbus, Dr. Deagan has found early Spanish fortifications in Dominica and Florida. She is presently seeking the Fountain of Youth. She is co-author of Fort Mose, Colonial America's Black Fortress of Freedom, which was winner of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History 1994 Annual Award of Merit, and the Florida Historical Society's 1994 Charlton Tebeau Award. In 2006, Kathleen received the Order of La Florida, awarded by the City of St. Augustine. Kathy Deagan.
Thank you, Meredith. That was a great introduction, although I wish you hadn't said the seeking the Fountain of Youth. I've been working at the Fountain of Youth for more years than I want to say, and it clearly isn't working. So I would like to pick up, in a sense, where Professor Gannon left off and talk about the period in Florida between Ponce de Leon and Pedro Menendez de Aviles in St. Augustine. It's an era that is unfamiliar to many Floridians and certainly people outside Florida. Here you see some of Ponce's jolly group. This is a time of tremendous interest in reenactments, particularly in St. Augustine, and there's the entire Ponce de Leon expedition has members reconstructed here in St. Augustine. And don't be nervous by this. I am not, you don't have to read all this. I'm not going to read all of this. But just to give you a sense that between Ponce de Leon, including Ponce, and Menendez, there were 11 attempts to settle Florida or to conquer Florida from 1513 to 1565. And it was only when Pedro Menendez de Aviles arrived in 1565 that there was any measure of success. This has led many historians, and this is a quote from our colleague Eugene Lyon, who called Florida the lovely, deadly land of La Florida because of the many attempts to try and pacify or conquer it. So I'm going to talk briefly, I hope, about some of the major expeditions and something about the people behind them. Who were these guys? Why did they fail? And I'm going to draw very heavily on the work of my colleagues Michael Gannon and Jerry Milanich, who's not here, and Barbara Purdy, who is here. So if you see them rolling their eyes, you know I've got something wrong here. All of the people who led the expeditions, every one of them who came to Florida, had certain things in common. They were all hidalgos. They were all born in Spain. Most of them were born to wealthy or noble families, minor nobility. All of them, before they came to Florida, had been in previous conquest expeditions throughout the Americas. And all of them were very wealthy. They financed most of these expeditions themselves and had become wealthy from booty in war, land grants, and slaves. Take Ponce himself, Juan Ponce. He was born in Valladolid in Castile in 1474. And he had been a squire to a very noble knight as a young man in his teen years. And he came he fought at Granada, the final war in the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors. And he came to America with Columbus in 1493 as a teenager and worked his way up in that early era of Hispaniola. He led the conquest and conquered the western side of what's now the Dominican Republic, excuse me, the eastern end of the Dominican Republic, and was governor of that region. Went on to conquer Puerto Rico, became governor of Puerto Rico before he started on his voyages that we've just learned about from Dr. Gannon. And this has always been a little puzzling to me, the kind of people who undergirded these expeditions with tremendous wealth and lots of experience. They were tough, hard conquistadors. But Florida was very hard, much harder than many of these other places to pacify or conquer. It's an interesting question. I know probably many people here have ideas or answers. Most scholars have thought, well, the native people of Florida were fought in ways that were unfamiliar perhaps to Spaniards. They just couldn't, they did not give in. The resistance was so tremendous among the Florida native people. Others have suggested that the conquistadors, the people who came to Florida, just didn't understand the environment. They didn't understand the weather, the food resources, the landscape, and they really weren't able to get a grip. That's possible, but you would think that I hate to say conquering, but capturing the Andes, the swamps of Central America, the Caribbean region would not have been more of a challenge than Florida. So it's an interesting question, why it took 50 years of repeated attempts to get a foothold in our state. And certainly I myself would give the most credit for causality to the many people of Florida, all of these people throughout the state, and thank you to Ted Morris for producing this map, had all encountered the Spaniards and all resisted them pretty rigorously. So the first person after Ponce who tried to settle Florida was Lucas Vasquez de Ione. He was born in somewhere between 1475 and 1480 in Toledo. He was a Mozarabe, a person who was a Christian under the Muslim rule. It was considered an ethnic group, so he did very well for being a Mozarabe. He was a lawyer, but he came to America in 1502 when Columbus was deposed and they sent a Spanish governor to rule Hispaniola. And he worked his way up in the administration system to become a really important judge. And he became wealthy there through careful allocation of lands and basically most historians say through lots of corruption. And he was sent his important mission in 1520. He went to Mexico because Hernán Cortés had really gotten out of hand, according to the Spanish officials in Mexico, and they had sent another person. I bring this up because we'll see Panfilo de Narvaez a little later. He was sent by the governor of Cuba to get Cortés under control, and they were fighting, and so then Lucas Vasquez de Ione got into the fray and tried to mediate things. He didn't mediate them, but went back to Hispaniola, but partly as a reward, he was given a charter to try and settle Florida. So in 1526, he sailed with 5 ships, 500 colonists, and about 100 African slaves. They formed a town called San Juan del Gualdape. No one knows exactly where it was. There are a lot of ideas. Many archaeologists working on that think it's somewhere near Sapelo Sound on the Georgia coast. If you look at the Georgia Encyclopedia, it's in Georgia. If you look on the South Carolina Encyclopedia, it's in South Carolina. And in fact, the Virginia Encyclopedia says it was the original site of Jamestown, which would be really interesting. But in any case, it was somewhere in that southeastern coast. It was a big town, but like a lot of early settlements, there was tremendous resistance from the Wali people who were the natives of the area. Everyone was sick. In fact, Ione himself died of a fever of sickness in October. They arrived in August. No one had food, they were starving. The people mutinied. There was a slave uprising that burned the settlement, and in fact, many of the slaves remained behind with the Wali people, and it was abandoned in November of 1526, and that would be just a spectacular site to locate and excavate. But it was abandoned. Again, we all wonder how no food could be available along the southeastern coast, but that's maybe a cultural decision by the Spaniards. The next person to try was Panfilo de Narvaez, who I have seen in more than one source described as both stupid and cruel. He was born in 1478 in Castile, in Valladolid. He fought in 1509 to 12 in the conquest of Cuba and really brutally suppressed Taino resistance and rebellion. And he became very wealthy through that process. He had landed estates and slaves, and he then was sent, because of his wealth and brutality, I guess, to suppress Hernando Cortez in Mexico, who had gotten, being too independent, too out of line. And Narvaez didn't succeed. Cortez captured him and put him in jail in Mexico, and he spent 2 years in a Mexican, well, a Spanish-Mexican prison, the first one probably, and came back in 1522 to Hispaniola, where, as again, a reward, he was given a charter to try and settle Florida, or to try and conquer, 1526, to explore and conquer Florida. So he left with 5 ships and 400 men, we assume mostly men, and landed in the region around Tampa Bay. And this is just from Florida, Tampa Bay, where his route was. But he inexplicably left his ships at Tampa Bay, and he took about half, maybe 300 men, to march overland to capture Florida, and then they were supposed to meet up later with the supply ships. Well, they got as far as fighting all the way with native people, just no attempt at negotiation or trade. It was apparently a real take no prisoners sort of expedition. But they, of course, had no plan of where to meet the ships, and so they never did meet up with the ships that sailed away. Narvaez and his men ended up near St. Mark's Bay, near Tallahassee, and ended up building rafts. They were, of course, starving, couldn't find any food, they were sick, and they built ships and sailed, trying to get to Mexico on these 4 rafts, 5 vessels, but of the 245 men who left on these rafts trying to get back to Mexico, only 4 survived. Many of you have heard of Cabeza de Vaca, that amazing account of Florida on the Narvaez expedition, and also of Esteban, one of the first African explorers. He had been a slave on the expedition, but ended up spending years wandering through the west and the southwest before they were finally rescued. And Narvaez has gone down in history, and Dr. Purdy might jump up and protest as one of the most ruthless yet incompetent conquistadors of the colonial era. And that's a quote. And then the next person to try to pacify Florida was Hernando de Soto. We know a lot about this, not only from the accounts, but from the extensive research of people like Jerry Milanich and Michael Gannon and Dr. Purdy. He was also from Extremadura, born in 1496. These were basically medieval men. He came to America in 1514 to Panama with Pedro Davarias to conquer Central America. And he was a conquistador, fought throughout Central America, and ended up with big estates in Nicaragua. And he became really rich, both through slaving and through his land holdings in Nicaragua. But in 1530, he decided I must have loved adventure more, and he went with Pizarro to Peru and became one of the leading captains in the conquest of Peru. He was one of the men of Cajamarca, and he was directly involved in the capture of Atahualpa, the Inca emperor. And he got another enormous fortune of booty and gold in Peru. In 1537, he was given the governorship of Cuba, along with a charter to explore and settle Florida. And this was really an epic trek, an epic march that began. There's still some discussion about where it actually began, probably Charlotte Harbor, marching all through Florida, around, up. It was really the most extraordinary 3-year trek. He had, there were 9 ships and about 620 men, including a few women, African slaves, some priests, and 220 horses, and a herd of swine that still is thought to have been the origin of all of the feral swine, wild pigs in much of the southeast. De Soto himself died at the Mississippi River, and the rest of his men made it down to the coast, built ships, and many of them made it back to Panuco on the east coast of Mexico, but kind of between Yucatan and Texas. Just a tremendous amount of information about native peoples and their sites and so on. And I would recommend Jerry Malanich's book, Hernando de Soto and the Indians of Florida, if you'd like to know more. It's also exciting for archaeologists because this is one of the few expeditions or efforts before St. Augustine in Florida where there's some trace, a physical trace on the landscape of de Soto's expedition. The martensite, you can see here, is almost assuredly where de Soto spent the winter of 1539 to 1540. It's within sight of the Capitol on Appalachia Parkway in Tallahassee. You can visit the site, but they did find crossbows and 15th century coins, beads of the right time period, and so on. Pig teeth, which was a really telling piece of evidence, along with native pottery. The Tatham Mound site, which is near Withlacoochee, just south of us, also had a lot of evidence for conflict with between Native Americans and Spaniards, including bones that had been struck by metal swords, and these beads and kinds of European items that were typical of that 1540 period. And this is a faceted chevron bead. You can tell from the nails it's a true archaeologist holding the bead, and it's the kind of the signal, the hallmark for a de Soto era site throughout the southeast, these kinds of beads. So archaeologists are pleased about that. After de Soto, it was a while before someone else took up the cause to come to Florida, Tristan de Luna y Arellano. He was born also in Spain in 1519 and came to Mexico in 1530. His father was the governor of Yucatan, and he married a very wealthy widow, Isabel de Rojas, and became a conquistador. He was with Coronado marching through Mexico before he came to Florida on that whole search for Cibola. And in 1557, he was chosen by the governor of Mexico to head an expedition to not Pensacola, but Santa Elena, South Carolina, which is where Parris Island is today near Beaufort, South Carolina. But it was his goal, his assignment was to found a base camp, a settlement on the Gulf Coast of Florida or Gulf of Mexico, then make an overland route to Santa Elena and establish a center there so there would be a good protected communication route between the Atlantic coast of Florida and Mexico. So he set off with the biggest expedition yet, 11 ships and 1,500 people, both soldiers and colonists. And this was a really, it was a big expedition. And they arrived in August in 1559 at what they called Ochuse and what today we know as Pensacola Bay. And he founded a city and named it Santa Maria de Filipinas. But just 5 weeks after they landed, we're still on the ships, basically. A hurricane hit Pensacola, as it often does. and it destroyed all but really almost all the ships. There was one ship that was salvaged, and all of the food supplies, all of the building materials, the horses, everything perished in that hurricane. And so they spent a couple of years in Pensacola trying to figure out how to rebuild. The settlers were sent off to Alabama to live with native people and eat their food. And Ione kept sending people to find St. Helena, but in the end he never did find it. And people were starving, and there were the relief ships, some got sunk trying to come help them. And he was recalled to Spain by the king in 1561 in disgrace. And he died penniless in 1573 because of that. And this is another site. The only trace of the Ione colony is underwater. The University of West Florida and the Department of State have teamed up, and they've found now the Emanuel Point Shipwreck, which is definitely one of De Luna's fleet ships, has been located and excavated. It's a wonderful site with all of these are the kinds of things that came out of there. So here's the ships. But that's all that so far has been found. And the next expedition was the second, or only the third one, to come to Florida's east coast. And we all know about René de Laudonnière and Jean Rebo, French Huguenots who came to America not for conquest, but really for religious refuge. They were being persecuted in France by the Catholic monarchy, basically. And Laudonnière, Jean Rebo was the head of the Huguenots, and he came in 1562 and established a settlement in this area, Charles Fort. It was there for about 3 months. They decided, oh, starving, mutiny, sickness, can't find anything to eat, went back to France. But 2 years later, Laudonnière returned with a colony to Fort Caroline, which was recorded as being at the mouth of the River of May, or the St. Johns River. And this was another story. They built a fort. These are Theodore Debris' engravings of Jacques Lemoyne's paintings, who he was on the French expedition. And they built the fort, but within a year, they too were starving, had nothing to eat, conflict with the Indians, and mutiny. They were about to leave the area, literally had packed everything up and were abandoning the site when Jean Rebo showed up with supplies. Now, this is an amazing story. There's some great things to read about it. I'll just only mention it briefly, but I'd first like to suggest that had the Spanish not come when they did to wipe out Fort Caroline, they might well have succeeded in establishing a colony that endured. The French had a completely different way of engaging with the native people. They became allies. They fought with the Jacksonville-Satiriwa Timucua against the Gainesville Potano Timucua, and really were allies and trade partners with the native people. It was a very different approach than any of the Spaniards had taken, and it probably would have worked. In any case, there was a race across the Atlantic in 1565. Rebo was racing to reinforce Fort Caroline. Menendez was racing to destroy Fort Caroline. And Menendez, that was not the primary purpose. He had already planned his journey of conquest and colonization of Florida before it was known that the French had established this. But by the time he left, the king knew, reinforced Menendez, and sent them with this primary mission. And that basically is why St. Augustine is where it is today, because it was the closest place where they could anchor and unload to Fort Caroline. But they arrived within 10 days of one another. The Spanish under Menendez skirmished with Rebo's people, and the French And then they retreated to unload and settle St. Augustine, and a storm blew up. Menendez marched in a hurricane, if any of the accounts are to be literally taken, marched in a hurricane from St. Augustine to north of Jacksonville at night, and took a couple of days, 2 nights, and camped overnight in Spanish Pond, a pond near Fort Caroline, and captured Fort Caroline with almost no casualties. It was a complete surprise. They didn't expect it. And a lot of the men were on ships trying to go after Menendez. That's a very bare bones story, but in fact, Spanish did take over Fort Caroline, renamed it San Mateo, and a few weeks later, the remnants of the men who had gone after, of Rebo's fleet, who had gone after Menendez, shipwrecked and had a camp at approximately where Canaveral is, marched up the coast, and that's the famous, at Matanzas Inlet, Menendez killed all of the Frenchmen, all 200, except for the musicians who he spared. And and that brings us to the establishment of the town and fort of St. Augustine, which probably is where it is because of where Fort Caroline was. And here you see Jackson Walker's great first muster. And that really brings me to the end of my part of the story. Colonization was a whole different chapter. Menendez was able to make it work. The native peoples, for whatever reason, were not quite as hostile. He also fought with the Timucua against their enemies. And perhaps their numbers were decimated by then by disease, by political infighting among the Timucua. But I hope that you will join us to continue that story, really starting with our exhibit that Meredith mentioned that will open in October in St. Augustine and then come to Gainesville, First Colony. And that's our tale. Long before Jamestown, Spaniards, free and enslaved Africans and Native Americans crafted North America's first European settlement, St. Augustine. But it wasn't easy. Thank you.